Our next speaker is Rock Khanna, who is a senior partner with McKinsey & Company. He actually leads McKinsey's North American telecom practice, and he's served various leading media and telecom clients. I noticed that Rock spent a fair amount of time at Stanford with not just a bachelor's degree, but also an MBA and a law degree. So welcome, and thank you very much for coming, Rock.
Thanks. So I think I'm the last presentation between you and drinks or additional conversation, and heard the conversation about Twinkies and milkshakes, and I'm getting hungry, so I'll try and keep it quick. I was asked to talk a little bit about the future of carriers. The question is dumb pipe, smart pipe, how do you want to think about it? And just wanted to start by just giving you a perspective on where are carriers today. I think if you look across the entire ecosystem, there's a tremendous amount of growth, but it sure isn't finding its way to the telecom carriers. If you look at what's expected to happen over the next couple years, you're seeing the growth rates have already started to decline quite precipitously. This is the average growth. So if you just took the U.S., it's the 30 largest telecom players, and it's a weighted average. And it says, what is it that people are expecting by way of revenue growth for them? It's about 2%, and that's being generous. So you have this conundrum where what's going on is, even though they are the straw in the milkshake, they're not getting paid for it. And the real question is, so what do you do? And I think that's, one of the questions that people are struggling with. I would say that, if you disaggregate this and you broke it apart, you'd see it's a bit different, depending on whether it's wireline or wireless, and you'll see wireline drags it down. If you look at wireless, there's voice, and then there's data, and you see data still growing quite explosively. But at its core, it's not, these are the growth rates of the companies, and even though data is growing so fast, you're seeing with the penetration levels of subscriptions and the like, the voice is now starting to decline at a mid-single digit rate, and it's hard to overcome that. So net, I think carriers are facing quite a challenge here around the core product isn't growing the way you'd like. The second thing would say, well, why is it? Why is it that, they haven't invested more in being at the cutting edge of a lot of these technologies? Why is it that Google and Facebook and Apple and others have done so well? There's a few challenges, I think, from, their perspective. One is, from a margin point of view, if you think about the traditional business, it's always been very, very EBITDA rich. It's driven 40% plus margins. If you think about how folks have grown, it's been through a series of different acquisitions. If you look at what Verizon has done, or SBC, now AT&T has done, and is planning to do, you'd see that most of what's going on is a series of horizontal acquisitions with a significant amount of cost takeout that drives additional margin. That's the play that has worked historically. It's not necessarily a play that drives additional growth given where the market is right now. The second thing is, given the size of many of the largest players, be it Sprint, T-Mo, Verizon, AT&T, you're talking about massive businesses. The smaller, startup opportunities just don't move the needle. So at the end of the day, they're, for it to be interesting to them, you've got to drive $1 billion of cash. It takes a long time for a digital locker to drive $1 billion of cash. Right? So that's the second thing is, they've got this margin requirement, and they got this challenge that's associated with being, $50, $100 billion companies. Very different. Then lastly, historically, these are not companies that have been known for innovation. Many of the attempts that they've made in the past to try and buy smaller companies just have not worked. There's not a significant track record of it. So against this backdrop, you have the challenge of, hey, growth is not what we'd expect it to be or would like it to be. There's some very fundamental challenges to really growing these businesses. And so that's, the challenge I think people are facing. The other thing that's not on here is, it is clear that these companies have been incredibly good at horizontal acquisitions, taking out costs, driving 40% margins, et cetera. So the real challenge then becomes, if you want to participate in a different business and you want to grow quicker, what is it you need to do and where is it you want to play? And what we've seen, and this is a bit of an eye chart here, but I'll tell you, if you looked at this 5 years ago, it would have been a lot cleaner. A lot cleaner. But what's happened is everyone is playing with everyone, and you're seeing, whether it be Apple, is now across multiple devices. It started with the PC, then they moved to audio, now they're in the smartphone area, now they're in TVs and DVDs. You see the same thing with Google, you're going to see the same thing with Facebook, you see the same thing with Microsoft. You're seeing a battle where there are other large players who are really developing platforms. And the challenge for the carriers is now, against this backdrop, where is it that they play? Where is it that they are advantaged? What is it that they can do? And in particular, we're seeing what I would say is a move towards a number of ecosystems or paradigms, however you want to think about it, within the wireless world. And what we've basically seen is if you took the wireless ecosystem and you took it from content all the way down through devices, the three different plays that we're seeing people make. The first is end-to-end vertical integration. That's basically the Apple model. They've got the content, they've got the service, the network they haven't totally vertically integrated yet. They've got the OS, and they've got the device. And they control the entire experience. Even with respect to the carriers, they dictate the terms more or less around how it is that they're going to work. There's another model, which is more the horizontal disaggregation model, and you'll see Facebook has done a lot of this, and it's around take a particular component of it, whether it be content, value-added services, and really deliver a premium product or service there so that people go to you for that. And you've got hybrid models, and Google's probably in the hybrid model piece, with Android being an example of where they might be more vertically integrated than elsewhere. But then you have other pieces like Gmail, et cetera, where they've got more of a specific solution. And the question really for the carriers is where across these do they choose to play? And I think it's one of the questions that most carriers are struggling with. Is it, and that there's not a straightforward answer, unfortunately, because many of the things that they'd like to be able to do actually are very challenged. So carriers have better information than anyone else on many different dimensions, but they've also got a bunch of privacy regulations that prevent them from using that information or sharing that information. If you think through the leverage that they have, and you think through the smartphones and the like, in many instances, the ecosystems are now really dictated by Android, Apple, potentially Microsoft, or perhaps RIM. So if you look through it, I think what's going on is carriers are right now in a conundrum. They're not growing at anywhere near the growth rates that they would aspire to. In fact, the market now treats them like utilities. The dividend yields on most, like an AT&T or a Verizon, is 6, 7, 8%. They've got dividend payout rates north of, in some cases, 75, 80% of cash flow. So people are thinking about them that way. They're playing in an increasingly competitive space, and it's less than clear what they go do. So I think what it means is if you're a carrier, you really need to think through and go back to, where across this do you think you have advantage? And we're still in the process of thinking this through, and I think the answer actually depends on the carrier, depends on where you are in the world, what you're even in the U.S., there's a very different answer for what would be the right answer for a Verizon versus an AT&T, just given their subscriber bases and the smartphone penetration, which devices they have, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what we would say is there's a lot of work that needs to be done around thinking through where there is a basis of competitive advantage. And our sense on it is it's going to really require breaking glass and changing a lot of the paradigms that they've historically operated under. We don't think it's realistic to hold these new businesses to the same sorts of requirements that you've had the old businesses on. We think that there may be organizational components where, in order to drive growth, and you've seen this recently in Spain, Telefónica has created an entirely new business unit that's focused on growth, because that way they can get the attention and the resources that's needed. And there's probably going to need to be more risk taking than has historically taken place. So net, our sense on it is, unless carriers are comfortable living with this profile where they've got 1%, 2%, 3% growth, and reflect a utility type investor set and profile going forwards, they're really going to have to change the game, and it's going to be very different. And our sense on it is some will and some won't, and likely those that will and succeed will be the ones that are able to dictate the terms going forward.
Thank I think getting past those challenges is going to be the critical factor, right? Like being able to get enough spectrum to deploy in a meaningful sense in critical markets that are already kind of competitively saturated, right? So I think that while during the 700 megahertz spectrum, we looked at new carriers coming in and developing a nationwide network for public safety. And we hear increasingly about new carriers developing nationwide networks to be competitors for the entrenched companies. But the amount of capital in 14, 15, 20 billion dollars in order to build that to a standard that would provide the types of services, I think is a little bit in question. So when you start, obviously Light Squared and others have a perspective about how they believe they can do it within the bounds, but I think that they're going to be significantly challenged to I keep getting technical difficulties tonight. To one, kind of free up and reallocate that spectrum that they have to find additional spectrum that's not being used. I mean, Sprint does have a lot of spectrum that they're not using. I don't know if they'd be interested, but it's also a very complex spectrum to redeploy and to actually use as well. So I think that's going to be the bottleneck, and I think it's going to be up to kind of government and corporations working together to try and figure out how to free additional resources up for that.
Absolutely. I think the real question, though, is as you think about digital life services or perhaps other plays for AT&T and others, the real question is that going to be meaningful, right? So when you're talking about a company like AT&T, it's a $120+ billion revenue company. Digital life would have to be phenomenally successful to move the needle on a company of that size magnitude. I think it's absolutely a step in that direction. The real question in my mind is really around what type of commitment is required in order to move the needle. And as you start dimensionalizing for a company of that size, being able to move the needle from 1.5% to 3% growth, you're talking about adding a $5 billion business over the course of 3 years. And despite the rosiest of projections one might have for digital life or other things like that, I don't think that's going to be what's going to be able to move their needle in terms of growth. I do think it's a move in that direction. Our sense on it, though, would be for companies of this size and scope, you need dozens more of things like that, or you need bigger plays even than that, with potential for monetization at an order of magnitude difference.
What Ashok was asking about is, given that there's net neutrality rules or guidelines coming out from the FCC very shortly, even as soon as next week, how does that affect the OTT players with regards to their business models? And clearly, one. I guess I'll take this one. I think everyone understands the model of Netflix, to date. They've taken very inexpensive, somewhat musty content and resold it at a nice margin and have built an interesting business. Clearly, there's a few aspects to their model. One is paying for paying the fair share of the rents for content, upgrading the content, and then finally, what do you do about the provider? And when you talk to the cable cos and you start seeing some of the percentages, clearly video is driving bandwidth in a big way. When you talk to even the smaller cable cos that maybe are just hungry to get certain customers, my experience with them is that they're even in more trouble, right? So they're all screaming, saying, can we please get some sort of fair share type commitment for that? But at the same time, bandwidth is bandwidth. So I think it will end up going to, over time. I don't know about next week, and I'm not tracking it, but I think the wireless industry has created some interesting paradigms around usage-based pricing. Clearly, when you look at the fixed line industry, it's still the issue around 2 or 3% using 40% of the bandwidth, and if there's some middle ground that deals with that far part of that far part of the curve, then I think that's where it'll end up.
I was trying to think of a lot of different questions we could talk about. I mean, we didn't get to cover mobile payments, mobile wallets, NFC. We didn't get to cover mobile app development. But I think one question that I'll hope to conclude with that everybody on the panel can opine on that we've heard about, which is this final one on video, right? And I'll provide a little bit of context here, which is, at least to me, I find the notion of, even if I want to be in lean back mode, sitting in front of my 60-inch TV, the notion of me paying $150 a month for 400 channels, of which I only watch 5. And oh, by the way, I don't use the device. I use this to navigate both Uverse and Xfinity. I just find that kind of odd, right? It feels like very 1980s-ish. It feels like the discussion between linear and nonlinear feels like, remember the thing called the DVD, right? And what did Apple do to music, right? So I guess the innovation question for the panelists would be, what is holding back somebody from doing to video what Apple has done to music? And maybe we'll start with Rob in terms of maybe it's a demographic issue or maybe it's appeal to a particular type of audience issue as a first question on that one.
I'll use a mic that works. I think at the end of the day, discretionary income is not growing as fast as the opportunities for people to offer services. So really what we're talking about is, what are people going to spend less on so they can spend more on things like over-the-top video? If you really think about Netflix, it's not a threat to cable, it's a threat to HBO and Cinemax and Showtime today. It's shaving the amount people spend, right? And it's going to spend less on premium channels, still keep my basics so I can watch live events. So that's the impact so far. To be truly disruptive, somebody has to pay the freight, as George was saying. I think somebody has to pay the fair share because the household's not going to be able to afford the cost of the bandwidth to consume what they consume today, which is 130 some hours a month. To consume that online would be completely cost prohibitive. So,
well, but the counter would be, I'm ready to drop my 150, and I'll pay $10 a month to HBO and $10 a month to ESPN, which is 3x what they get from Comcast and Cox.
right,
So
but
why
then,
wouldn't they go direct to me?
then how much is your broadband going to cost you?
I'll pay $50 for that, or 70. The point is, but you get the point, right? And there's a whole generation of kids now that just can't afford $70 a month for 300 channels, and they're more than happy to go.
But today they're getting
direct.
paid $5 a month times every household the cable operator passes.
Right, so you've hit that's the
That's-
issue. The flywheel is too big,
Right.
right? So
There's a well-established business model that they're not going to give up easily, right?
yeah. George, your thought?
The flywheel being too big is sort of the driver as to why I said what I said with 2012, not as much change. The other aspect is a certain amount of the population, and I'm part of it, are addicted to sports. I'm just addicted. So, without sports, and you don't need TV for news. In fact, I think most of us probably get our news in this demographic through the internet. Most of my children's programming is on demand, although through Xfinity. So it's because of that, that's what's holding on the subscription. But you're exactly right. When I poll our new hires, either from undergrad or MBA, none of them have a cable subscription. None of them intend to get a cable subscription. And maybe an interesting Nielsen factoid would be to study what's happening in that part of the market.
How about Rock?
I'd add one other dimension to it, which is if you think through who owns what and the conflicts of interest, I think that in many instances the cable companies, et cetera, actually also own the content, and they also determined what price broadband costs and have introduced usage-based pricing. So I think that while there may be consumer demand for it, I'm certain there is, and there are certain segments of it. I think there's also another dimension of it that you need to think through, which would be around the incentives of the folks on the other end in aggregate for their entire business system. And I'm not sure exactly how the math works on that. I suspect that it actually doesn't work as well for the folks who actually own the content as well as the distribution in many instances.
Right. Greg?
So I think there are a couple things. One, fundamentally, is the bits and bytes themselves. If you think about it, the reason my premise is hypothesis, and we could debate it, is the reason that Apple succeeded is because Napster happened. Because though, if you look at the difference between a piece of music and a video, a 30-minute clip of video, or an hour or 2-hour movie, it's significantly different, right? The time it takes to download, the time it takes to use that type of thing. Music was, and to some degree, accepted, pirated, right? And so the music companies had two options, right? They could continue to deal with the pirated music, or they could go with they could go with another alternative, which Steve Jobs turned into a phenomenal moneymaker, but nobody ever thought he was going to do that well, right? So I think there's the underlying technology and the type of the technology and the download and everything else, which I think 4G will actually help. And I think the other thing driving it is advertising, quite frankly, is like a lot of the advertising revenue, because they can't come up with great metrics to track all this stuff, a lot of the content supported is advertising supported content. Now, you may not materially be watching the show. Concurrently, I can't pay attention to more than 2 things at one time, but the advertisers think I can, and they're paying for that. So until that advertising model shifts, I think people are going to be very reticent to let that move.
Terrific. Well, as an investor, I'm hopeful that somebody is brave enough to, the margins on this guy were about -1%. The margins on this are incredible. I'm hopeful someone is smart enough to figure out how to change the video world so that we can actually watch what we want to watch when we want to watch it. And let's thank our terrific panelists.
I want to thank our moderator, Nelson. Thank you very much. Yes, good job.